Hey, and welcome to Reporting In. I am your host, Malcolm Fleschner. This is the TYT Network show dedicated to investigative journalism. We talk to reporters and journalists from all over the globe, some who work for TYT, others who are outside of the TYT fold, find out the stories they're covering, the stories they're planning on covering, and maybe get the story behind the story, if you know what I mean. I'm not even sure if I know what I mean. But today on the show, I'm excited because we're talking to Nicole Lewis, who is, she covers criminal justice issues for the Marshall Project, and she's never been on the show before, so she's new. So let me first just welcome you, Nicole. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
I really appreciate your taking the time for us, and mainly the focus, the reason why I reached out to you is to talk about the most recent prison strike, the nationwide prison strike. But before we get to that, I'll give a little bit of your bona fides, which, so as I said, you're the Tao Reporting Fellow with the Marshall Project, and previously you worked for the Washington Post Fact Checker blog, and you've won awards upon awards. Well, at least you're an award-winning. We discussed before. You're an award-winning journalist, so congratulations for that. So before we get to talking about the prison strike and everything, I like my new guests. I like to talk about their background, how they got into journalism. I assume it was for the money, and especially because you cover prison issues, that's where the money's at in journalism for sure. So, what's your background that led you to journalism in the first place?
Sure. So I actually started off as a community organizer, and I was specifically working to engage people around issues of racial and economic inequality across the country. And so as part of my work, I wrote a short book, mostly for our base, and realized that in writing, I could sort of reach like a much larger audience, and that it started this really important dialogue about the issues that we were, very interested in. And so journalism seemed like a pretty natural next step to keep that work going.
And do you find that your expectation of what a journalism career would be and what it has actually turned out to be were one and the same, or is it nothing like what you expected?
No, I would say it's pretty much what I thought it would be, that I'm able to sort of go out, speak to people, really get, especially with the Marshall Project, to go deep on particular issues that I'm interested in, have like a broad sort of understanding of the issues that I'm trying to write about. And then I get to sit down and, figure out how to put these issues together on the page that people read it. Oftentimes they write or they tweet, and we just keep sort of going from there. So it's been pretty enjoyable so far. Yeah,
I think the age of social media has certainly made the journalism professional more of a two-way street than it used to be, in terms of people responding to your. Obviously, you're always going to be going out and talking to people, but people responding to your work afterwards, for good or ill, is much more commonplace nowadays, and some journalists don't like it so much. Oh my God, the public is horrible. It turns out, but. So when you worked for the Washington Post Fact Checker blog, what did you do? Like, how would you choose what facts to check, and what qualifies as do you just have to be a busybody? Is that a good prerequisite for being a fact checker?
Yep. So we were just, constantly watching the news. Anytime a politician was in front of a camera talking, campaigning, talking about new legislation, and looking for little tidbits of facts that we could say, hey, that doesn't quite sort of add up to what we know. Or sometimes I would say, I'm not really sure if this is true, but let me sort of just start to do a partial fact check. And then once we realized that maybe the claim was sort of off base, that it would warrant like a full-blown fact check where we'd really try to get to the bottom of what they're saying, to kind of get underneath the rhetoric to tease out what the actual information is.
I always thought that since the rise of Donald Trump, like his administration or like a Donald Trump speech would make being a fact checker super easy, because you could be like, nope, there weren't any. Turns out zero. Now I'm going to cut out for an early lunch. But being a fact checker, it probably opens you up to all the more criticism, because you're trying to say that our research is definitive, and we're the judge, jury, and executioner on this one. That's a terrible expression. I shouldn't use it. And then people pushing back and be like, no, you're biased just like everybody else, and it goes on. But that's the nature of the beast today. All right, let's move on to talking about the Marshall Project and how long have you been with the Marshall Project now?
Actually started in January of this year.
Okay, so you're relatively new. And what does the Marshall Project do for our fans who are unaware?
Sure. So we're a nonpartisan, nonprofit newsroom, strictly covering the criminal justice system. So anything from courts to cops and policing to bail, prison, sentencing, judges, any aspect of the criminal justice system we are writing about.
But yeah, I look back and the story. Some of the stories you covered are super interesting, and I don't know if we're going to have time to get to those, but because I do want to talk about the most recent prison strike, which, as far as prison strikes go, has gotten a fair amount of press comparatively. Although, generally speaking, prison strikes often they make barely a blip on the radar. So, I guess the first thing I want to ask you about is, what are the unique challenges to covering not just criminal justice systems, but specifically prisons, because by definition they're closed systems, and your access to prisoners and reaching out to people who are affected by life in prison is limited by the system that you're trying to write about, and so there's a vested interest in them not giving you access, I presume. So how do you even report on that in a way that's going to be comprehensive, where you get access to the kind of stories you need to get to?
That's right. I mean, you hit the nail on the head. So access is the biggest challenge, one of the biggest challenges for us. As you can imagine, if we're reporting on like an inmate death or some sort of inhumane conditions, that the official channels might not be that interested in giving us, information quickly or as detailed as we might want it. So what we do often is work to build sources inside the prison. So people who are directly impacted, obviously, by incarceration, people who are living that experience. As well as filing freedom of information requests directly to the state, as well as to the Federal Bureau of Prisons. So this allows us to get, reports and data that are not published publicly, not online, and help us get a sense of what's really happening. But at the same time, even as we build sources among inmates, it's difficult for them to be able to speak freely. Communication is monitored. Sometimes we are just writing letters, which takes time to go, to be received and then to come back to us. So it's very difficult in a breaking news environment where we need to know what's happening right now to really have like any sort of sense of a full picture. And I would say at the same time, another incredible challenge is that the majority of people who are incarcerated in state prisons. And so there's no like uniform governing body that oversees every state, right? So if we want information, we need to go state to state to state and work with each Department of Correction in that state. And so that can be incredibly challenging as well. When we think about data or how records are kept, there might not be any uniform system for doing that in each place. So we have to think about, if we're going to file an information request, how do we normalize data? How do we get it back? So largely, it's a lot of just source building, working with advocates, working with lawyers, public defenders, people who are constantly in contact with inmates, looking for lawsuits that are being filed. There are tons of information and details in in particular class action lawsuits that get filed by inmates. So those are some of the ways that we try to get around this lack of access. It is by no means easy, but it is well worth it, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, the challenges seem almost insurmountable sometimes, but at least the prisoners are not unaware of this. They know the challenges they're facing, and so they presumably, when they're going to go on strike or have a group action like this, there's a media strategy, and maybe that's what has made the difference this time. Their media strategy has been better. But so let's get a little bit basic information about the strike. When did it start? It's concluded now, right?
That's right.
And it was scheduled it was going to be a 3-week strike, right? A work stoppage, and individual inmates, and my understanding is that they were going to decide for themselves what the strike would consist of for them, whether it be a work stoppage or they would, whatever else. But let's start with the demands. What were they seeking? Because I think the unfortunate reality is that while the United States has 25% of the world's incarcerated population and only 5% of the world population, I think there's a woeful ignorance about what goes on inside prisons among the general populace. So, and that's what this is about partially, is highlighting that. So what are the conditions that they're specifically targeting for this strike, whether they succeeded or not, but they talked about as their demands?
Sure. So let me sort of back up a little bit too. The strike was called in response to the death of 7 inmates at Lee Correctional Facility in South Carolina. So there was a riot that took place last April, and seven men died there. And so this group of, incarcerated organizers, people who were saying, hey, we need to figure out a way to bring some changes, sort of said, we've got to do something. We've got to raise these issues up to, put the national spotlight on them, bring attention to the kinds of things we're facing. And so some of the issues that just in having conversations with organizers, both inside and outside of prison, that they're most particularly interested in changing is overcrowding in the prisons, unexplained inmate deaths, lack of access to healthcare, extreme temperatures, abuse by guards, inedible food, and of course, prison labor. And so the inmates put out a set of 10 demands that addressed, different aspects of that sort of broad swath of issues. The first two, one is about an immediate change to conditions inside of prison, to recognize that the people who are incarcerated there are in fact human and deserve, human rights, basic dignity, edible food. The second is about prison labor, specifically that inmates, many inmates work and they do so for very little money. And so they're asking to be paid the prevailing minimum wage in where, the state in which they're incarcerated. And the rest of the demands, there are about 8 more, are specifically sort of addressing aspects of what we call mass incarceration. So different levers or sentencing elements that they say have contributed to the kind of overcrowding, from gang enhancement tactics, which mean that if one person is working in a group and they have are convicted of selling drugs, that everybody is sort of being wrapped up and they can get charged with the most maximum offense in their group, to truth in sentencing, meaning that people have to spend at the barest minimum 85% of their ultimate sentence before they can become eligible for parole. And then other issues like restoring voting rights to ex-offenders. So some of these things we actually, restoring Pell Grants to people in prison. And so Pell Grants are government-sponsored aid so that inmates can attend college while they're incarcerated. And other issues like getting more access to rehabilitation, so making sort of prison a place where people are not just there, sort of rotting away or wasting their time, but they have real opportunities so that once they are able to leave, they have some sort of prospects for living in the broader world. And so some of these demands are already things that are starting to percolate across the country. Particular the voting rights, restoring voting rights to ex-felons is something that we've seen take hold in Virginia. In Florida, people will have the opportunity to vote as to whether or not they think ex-felons should be able to vote. So it's kind of an interesting list of things that, both would make a material difference in their day-to-day, as well as things that reformers are already starting to take up on the outside.
Right, and for after they get out. It seems like all these demands boil down to the issue of whether the purpose of the criminal justice system is to warehouse and just hold these people in prison for as long as we are holding them and then just release them and then we wash our hands of the matter, or if we actually want to rehabilitate. Is it simply punitive and we want to make people suffer as much as we possibly can, or are we looking to refashion society and have these people get reform themselves, so to speak, and then become contributing members of society, which we're doing very little, it seems, and less than we used to. But the idea of a prison strike, I'm sure a lot of people who don't understand what prison life is like, people on the outside would say, strike, how can you're in prison, how can you go on strike? But so I'd like you to talk to a little bit about how much prisons are actually run by the prisoners these days and the amount they work, and then also the work that prisoners do for outside companies. So we see in the story that they're going on strike and they don't want to make 30 cents an hour anymore. They want to make minimum wage in working for Victoria's Secret. I read it, I say, what are prisoners doing for Victoria's Secret? So those are two things I wanted to ask you about, how the prisons are actually run by prisoners and the work they do for outside contractors or contracted
Sure.
for outside companies.
Totally. So much of the sort of day-to-day maintenance or just upkeep of the prison is done by inmates. And so that could be anything from preparing food in the mess halls to cleaning the facilities, to maintaining the grounds. There's just a ton of work that inmates do to keep the prison just generally operational. And so inmates are paid for that as well, but generally paid less than people who are able to work for a sort of private contract. So many companies contract with their local prisons as well as federal prisons to have access to, to very inexpensive labor. And so there are inmates, across the country who make furniture, who press license plates, who do, like what you're saying, the sewing of garments for apparel companies. I teach intro to journalism at a local college here. And one of my students pointed out that the test blue books that they use are put together by inmate labor, something that, I hadn't recognized before. So there's just a very wide range of work that's done. And by and large, the work that happens in prisons, inmates are not compensated at any kind of federal minimum wage or even, state minimum wage. We're talking about, 40 cents to $1 an hour. So, people are working, and they're working long hours under various conditions. It's very mixed. We've written some commentaries about inmates who work in chicken processing plants and how dangerous it can be to do that kind of work. People sort of just get hurt in the machinery and lose fingers, lose arms. I mean, it can be really, really dangerous, and then don't have the same ability to file a lawsuit or just get sort of the medical attention that they need, right? So that's also another issue there.
Out here in California, we have these fires. That a lot of the people fighting fires are prisoners, and they're doing it for bare bones sub minimum wages, and it's a scandal. It should be a scandal.
That's right. It's a dangerous job, and it's a job that they could not get once they're released with a record. And so, I think I've seen a lot of sort of reporting and questions about, is that fair? Is that something that we should really be asking people to do in California, to risk their lives for, $1 a day for a job that they wouldn't be able to get with a criminal record? And so when these organizers called for a strike, they're basically saying, if it is possible for you, if you can, if there is enough sort of like room or safety or, freedom from fear of some sort of retribution, to not show up for your assigned job, to not go to work in the commissary, to not mop the floors or trim the hedges, or to not, sew the garments. But they're also saying, inmates spend a ton of money at the prison commissary, where the sort of basic goods like toiletries, soap, toothpaste, supplemental food is marked up much higher than it would be if you or I went to go buy it at our local convenience store. And so there was also a push or a request for people to not spend money at the prison commissary, in addition to going on hunger strikes. And so as far as I've seen in terms of participation, to me, it seems like the organizers of the strike have confirmed more often that people are choosing not to spend money as well as hunger striking more than they're able to not show up for their assigned role. And the reason for that is because it's just, inmates don't have a ton of autonomy. There's, fear of retribution, fear of retaliation, and lost wages, frankly, that many might not be able to make that kind of sacrifice for themselves, but they can, choose not to patronize the commmmissary.
Right. All the conditions that prevail for workers on the outside when they go on strike, they're sacrificing their wages, and the potential repercussions are multiplied tenfold, I assume, when you're in prison and you're already incarcerated and living at the whim of guards and whoever's administering the prison. But it's one thing. I'm not going to buy my toothbrush at the commissary or the prison store or whatever it's called, versus going on hunger strike. Hunger strike is serious business. And when you hear about participation rates, I know that it's very difficult to get hard numbers, but do we have a number of states or prisons in a very number of states? I heard Canada. There were also Canadian prisons that were participating. Do you have any idea what the level of participation is or has been?
Sure. So I don't have like a general sense of overall numbers, but I will say that organizers have confirmed participation in about 14 states. And so what this could mean is that it could mean as many as one person or two people are on hunger strike or not spending money at the prison store. But it does show that the message has spread across the country. And so there are about 14 states now that organizers are saying have confirmed participation. The unfortunate thing is that when we oftentimes go back to sort of double check this information with the prison officials, they tend to say, "Oh no, we don't have any confirmed work stoppages." So there's a tendency to sort of downplay. I think we'll have a much better sense of how large or how robust this strike actually was, a few months down the road, when all the information sort of is able to come back through these, unofficial channels, and the people can sort of talk to their loved ones and just get a better sense of what actually happened in these 3 weeks.
Well, I mean, I know that the organizers of the strike were not, they weren't deluding themselves about how this was going to have an immediate impact and all of a sudden the dramatic overnight change, but it's part of the larger effort overall towards criminal justice reform. And before, we only have a couple minutes left, but before we go, I wanted to talk to you about what the prospects are for moving forward on any of these and the issues that, not only the issues that the strikers or the prisoners themselves were highlighting, but others that are related within the criminal justice system. And I've heard that there is actually an unusual and unexpected advocate for prison reform in the Trump administration, in one Jared Kushner, who we all thought was basically a waste of space. But it turns out that he may, through a variety of circumstances that are unusual, that he may care about prison reform. Do you know what I'm talking about, or is this? So can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure, absolutely. So yeah, there have been reports that Jared Kushner is both interested in actual sentencing reforms, so an issue that Congress refused, or it was not able to basically take up in the First Step Act, and it has been sort of unofficially reported out as well that he is part of the overall presidential pardons or clemency process. So this is the process by which the White House is able to use its power to either commute people's sentences or to pardon people. But I think the most important part when we talk about criminal justice reform is to recognize that the majority of reforms take place at the state and local level. And again, that's because there's this, separation between federal prison and state prison. And so state legislatures, bipartisan legislatures all across the country are taking up criminal justice reform, are thinking about sentencing changes, are thinking about, how do we deal with the opioid crisis without just throwing people into prison? How do we think about rehabilitation and treatment? That there's a real interest across the country, mostly due to the fact that incarcerating so many people is extremely expensive. And in many states are dealing with figuring out how to either let people go home or to build a new facility to spend millions more dollars. And so they have a real sort of vested interest in taking this issue on. It's sort of unclear to me, at the federal level, what might change. But that's a much smaller share of the nation's inmates.
Right. So that's an interesting point that I think we rarely, that is rarely brought up in this, that it is a state-by-state issue. But it also means that it seems like you can have a greater impact because moving Congress, the U.S. Congress, that's, it's a battleship, and turning it around anyway is difficult. But state legislatures, and they're the ones, they have tight budgets, and they have to balance their budgets. So, and putting people in prison is just much more expensive than, for example, educating them. And keeping people in prison who have been in prison for 40 years and really are no longer a threat to the extent that they even were at one point. You can make an argument on economic grounds for reform. So I guess before I let you go, I just want to ask, now that we look back on this strike, and you say we still can't assess its success or its long-term impact, I guess I wanted to ask you about the media depiction, because these are stories that you're covering all the time. I'm sure there are stories you cover and you get frustrated because you think this is important and it should get a wider view across the media. And that probably doesn't happen as much as it should. So how do you reflect on this strike and the way the mainstream media, to the extent that it has been covered, that it got coverage, and was the coverage pretty good overall?
Yeah, I would say it's been interesting to see how robustly the mainstream media, just media in general, has taken the strike. I think that this sense that this coverage of 2018 strike was very different than 2016 is shared by both me as a journalist as well as the organizers of the strike themselves, who said that they were just slammed, like truly inundated with media requests. I think that most of the coverage has been incredibly positive, has focused a lot on prison labor. I've heard from some of the organizers that they wished that there was more conversation about the rest of the demands. There were 10 sort of national demands. But I think just reflecting back from all the conversations that I've had with, everyone involved in bringing this strike about, that they're really excited by the media attention, but also recognize that, this is not the clear end goal, that bringing these issues to a broader audience is really important so that people are motivated to vote for candidates, vote for leaders who believe in criminal justice reform, and have a better, more informed sense of what's happening in prisons, in their state, in their community. So I think the organizers are, seemingly excited, but recognize that there's much more work to be done. I saw that there was a petition recently started to bring these demands to the attention of Congress, because they recognize, it might be nice that the Washington Post is writing up the strike, but what does it really matter if the people who have the decision-making power aren't necessarily reading it? So the coverage has been sort of widespread, but I think that there's a sense that there's much more work to be done now.
Right, right. Well, doing our part a little bit here on reporting in, I appreciate your speaking with me. Nicole Lewis, as I mentioned, a TAO reporting fellow with the Marshall Project. I encourage people to follow her on Twitter and check out what she's written about on for the Marshall Project. I think you can just go to, is it themarshallproject.org?
That's correct.
And check out her stories there, other stories that she's written, really interesting. One about younger inmates and using like virtual reality to prepare them for life on the outside, and all sorts of interesting stuff that beyond just this strike, but also talking about this strike. And I hope you'll come back in the future talking about other important criminal justice issues as they come up, because I'm certainly interested in them, and I feel like the media does a lackluster job generally in covering them. So the more that we can do here, the better. And I think that you're a great resource for us. So I appreciate your talking to me.
Thanks so much. I'd be happy to join you again.
All right, great. And for those of you at home, thank you so much for watching Reporting In. It's a TYT member show. You get to see it before the general public does on YouTube. I hope you enjoy it. Let me know what you think in the comments below. And otherwise, I'll see you next time on Reporting In. Eventually they will, I'm gonna let you do it.